I'm going to show you how I transfer a sketch from tracing paper onto my watercolor paper. I like having a nice clean sketch on my watercolor paper so that I can eliminate the need to make unnecessary changes and then erasing and possibly destroying the vulnerable cottony surface of my watercolor paper. So I work out a sketch in a sketchbook, or I might sometimes sketch directly on the tracing paper pad. This is my preferred tracing paper because it's really transparent. So if I want to make corrections to my drawing, I can actually just lay another piece of tracing paper over top, and you can see how transparent it is here. So I've got lead using an HB pencil on one side of the tracing paper. Now what I need to do is get that drawing from my tracing paper to my watercolor paper. Because I currently only have lead on one side of my paper, if I flip it over to do the rubbing, my image is going to be in reverse. If you don't want the image to be in reverse, you can actually trace it twice on the tracing paper. Just don't trace the back side while the original sketch is on an important piece of paper like your watercolor paper. Make sure if you're sketching it a second time that you've got the leaded side facing down on a scrap piece of paper, or sometimes I just use the back side of my pad. So here I am with my HB pencil. I'm going to go over top of this sketch of the robin, and I'm going to give myself a much cleaner line than perhaps some of the detailed stuff that I did on the other side. I can always add details to the watercolor paper afterwards, but this initial transfer, I want the lines to be clean instead of sketchy. I have a tendency to put a lot of lines in as I'm thinking through a sketch. So I don't have to press hard. The HB pencil lead is fairly soft, so in doing this sketch, I have enough lead to work with for the transfer. So I can go over top of as much or as few lines as I want. If I'm afraid of it getting kind of messy and dirty, I can just stop here, just sketch out the main branch, and maybe I will just kind of wing some of the flowers, or perhaps, as I'm doing here, just pick out a few of the key flowers and then more add more spontaneous mark making on the watercolor paper itself. So I'm just getting kind of the flow and the scale of what I want recorded in advance. You can see here I missed a little branch, so I'm just adding that now. I'm wrapping his little claws around the branch. All right, so I've got the original sketch that I worked out on the tracing paper itself in the pad. I took the sheet out, I flipped it around, and I redrew on the opposite side so that when I take that picture, that new lead that I've put down will be facing my watercolor paper. And now the image is right side up. A lot of people miss that second step and then they're confused as to why their image is backwards. So you do have to trace it twice. If you're working from a photo on your laptop or your desktop, you can just reverse the image so that it's already reversed and then flip it back around once you're ready to paint. So I will secure my tracing paper just at the corners. I don't want to put tape directly on the watercolor paper because when I remove the masking tape, it can damage the paper surface. So I'm putting my taped edges on existing masking tape. Now you can use a burnishing tool like this one. It's for lettering. It's literally just called a burnisher, and it has a nice round steel nib with a ball at the end. And I find that that's a really easy way to kind of press this lead onto the surface of my watercolor paper. You could use a capped pen, like an old Bic pen. You can use a hard leaded pencil if you wanted to, like a 2H or a 4H to do this job. Now I'm just pressing with a medium pressure, going over all of the lines that I can remember. If you are concerned, you can do a back and forth sort of zigzag pattern. The only thing is I do find that sometimes that makes an embossed effect on your watercolor paper, so that pressure of zigzagging back and forth can lead to some depressed lines on the other side of your, or rather on your watercolor paper itself, and that's something I want to avoid. So I'm trying as much as possible to just go over the actual lines that I want so that I don't get any extra embossed texture. You can always take a peek partway through just to see how you're doing. Always make sure that you've kept a couple of pieces of tape on before you do this so that you don't accidentally dislodge your drawing. So I'm having a look here, and yeah, that looks pretty good. If there's any information that's missing, I can always lay it back down very easily and just go back over top again. So after that initial transfer, I went ahead and added some embellishments. I added a little bit more detail to the wings here using my 3H pencil. I use a 2H or 3H on the watercolor paper itself. That way I'm using a much lighter, harder lead, and it's less greasy and messy. And this is my little trick. I just take a kneadable eraser, which is one of those gray putty erasers. I just turn it into a snake and roll it over the surface. And that actually lightens your lead up without completely erasing it. You do want to keep your lines fairly dark where you have darker areas in the image itself. So where I know I'm going to be having darker washes of paint, I may actually want to make sure that those pencil lines are visible after those initial washes. In the flowers, however, they're going to be very light and spontaneous. You can see the key flowers that I drew originally, and then just with a few floating marks. I just want to create a beautiful atmosphere for the robin, give it some environment and some context, but I don't want the flowers to detract from the main subjects.